So today we are going to be working on our final project, but to begin, we're going to just kind of loosen up. I'm going to teach you a few skills on how to do some watercolor techniques. So we've been doing a lot of drawing with our shapes, right? All of the different shapes to form. So today we're just going to start class by doing some warm-ups and some technical practices in watercolor and how watercolor moves around a page and things like that. And then after that, we will move into coming up with our idea of how we want to do our final project. Okay, artists. So I'm going to teach you a few watercolor techniques today, and you'll just work on practicing them and then come up with a final drawing, a final painting for today. So the first thing I'm going to teach you is your wash. So a wash is really just taking your water and pigment, which is the color in the pan here, and you're really moving your brush in a very even stroke along the paper. And this is considered a wash because the color is consistent throughout. So this is kind of creating the consistent block of color, like so. You notice I didn't put a ton of water, so you don't want to overwater these pans. So just light on the water. Don't use too much. And remember to wash your brush in between each style. Okay, a gradient is our next one. And a gradient is using that same technique of adding pigment to your brush and getting that pigment down in a wash style. But instead of trying to keep that color the same all the way down, you're trying to make it dark to light. So to do that, you're going to start with just getting that amount of wash, a tiny amount on the top. Wash that brush. Kind of use your side of your container to take as much water off, because what you're going to do is start to move that color pigment down without moving too much of the pigment. So keeping a little bit at the top and starting to move it down to create that gradient look. So the darkest to medium to lightest. And you can keep going as long as you'd like. So you can start to see that this creates the dark to light. My next one is a glaze, and I do have to have my color dry. So I'm just going to put a little bit of orange down here and let it dry for a second, and we'll come back to our glaze. Okay, so you can see that my orange is now dry, so I am ready to do my glaze. So this is nice and dry, took a little time to let it settle. And now I'm going to take a different color and put it over the top. So when you have orange and blue together, what color does that make? Kind of a brown, right? So check it out. I can get a whole different color if I go over with my blue. Now, what happens if I go over that with maybe something closer to my color family and not opposite? Like, what if I put a yellow right over the top of that? You'll see that I get kind of a nice orange. Wet on wet. So wet on wet is taking that same idea of a wash and putting that down on the paper, the wash. And then you clean off your brush and grab a new color, and you're going to put, just as it says, wet on wet, you're going to put color right inside of that other color. So you can kind of see what happens. If you get frustrated with watercolors because they tend to go everywhere and move everywhere, it's because you might be working very wet on wet. So it's a fun time to kind of experiment of how those will play together and blend around each other by just moving your paper or adding more pigment into that you had that's opposite color or a different color. So I'll show you another wet on wet with the similar color. So if I take an orange here that's wet, and then I take maybe my yellow and go right back into that, you can see that it creates this really ominous color. So it's almost like blending paint together on one, but you can get it kind of looking, a little different and moving around on the page. All right, our next one is dry brush. So with dry brush, I'm really going to make sure that I have not a lot of water on my brush. And I might also just use a paper towel and just really dry my brush off, because if I don't want a lot of water on there. I'm going to go back into my palette here. This one has quite a lot of water in it, so I'm just going to make sure not to get too much on my brush here. And you can see that this is creating this awesome texture here. So I'm just really using not a lot of water and mostly that light amount of pigment. That's a nice, what it says, dry brush. So you can see that when I start adding a whole nother color to that, you can start to see how the texture, let's see, let's add a light blue this time. I can't really see that light blue very well. Let's try purple, a little bit of purple. So you can see that's creating a nice texture there, right? All right. So another way to get texture, I like to use different tools. So like I have myself a Q-tip, I have a stamp here. This is a jelly stamp or just a regular stamp. I tend to like these jelly stamps. But this is where I can just use maybe the texture of something to create the texture of the watercolor. So really kind of using a pattern or using a tool that maybe could create something different looking than just my brush might. For my stamp, the stamps don't come out as clear as maybe if you were to use an inking stamp pad, but you just paint right onto that stamp and you can get some great textures that come out that you might not get with your brush again. And same with this one. I just go ahead and do some painting with this one. Actually, I'm going to go for the dark black color so it really shows up for you all. You can see that that creates an awesome texture too that I can overlay some neat things. And look at, this is still wet, so check out what happens right now. Whoa, like going over a stamp right into that. Okay, got my hands a little messy. All right, so another thing that you can do is some oil pastels. So oil pastels are nice because with oil and water together, what will happen is you can get some resisting, right? So if I start to put my oil down and then I use another color and go right over the top, you can see that it's resisting that pastel. So that's a great way to kind of get a drawing in your background and then use the watercolor to fill in. All right, another fun one is using salt. So if you have salt available, you can again do that nice gradient wash. Get a good amount of, wet pigmented water on there. And then you're just going to take a tiny pinch and sprinkle it right on top. And you'll see that there's some things happening here with that gradient, or with that salt. So do you see what's going on? How that salt is actually taking and moving the water and the pigment towards itself. So the salt is absorbing the water and the water has pigment. So it wants to separate. So when that dries, I'll shake it off and show you what that looks like. Dry salt, so you can see, well, semi-dry, but you can start to see that that is what it looks like without the salt on there. Okay, artists, so you have successfully worked on different watercolor techniques, so you're ready to move on to the next part. So your next part is going to be to fill a 9x12 paper. So with a design that you're looking for. So this is going to be your background to your final piece. So really kind of think about like how you want to lay things out. Have some fun though, and get some textures. I will show you some different students from last year so that you can get an idea of what that looks like. And then if you have some extra time after you get your background and it's drying, get some more shapes down and some final shapes that you want, because what we're going to do is we're going to cut those shapes out and we're going to glue those on. So you can, if you have some extra time, you can draw some more of your little shapes or larger shapes if you want to go bigger, depending on what you want. So you'll just look at, I'll show you some student examples from last year so you can see how some students drew small shapes and some students drew big shapes, okay? So today is working with your small practice piece and then a full background. If you have extra time, start drawing some final shapes that you want for your foreground, right? So background is watercolor, foreground will be your little cutout shapes. Cutout shapes. Cutout shapes. Cutout shapes. Have fun, artists.